The girl was drowning in the water and thinking that even though she would die, she would live in her father's labors and they would never see each other again. His foolish daughter would soon be sacrificed, and she wanted only one thing: for her father to live a long life. The protagonist was lying on a mountain of jewels and heard someone's voice waking her up. Opening her eyes, she saw a huge mouth and nostrils. The girl decided that the Lord of the Underworld himself had come for her. Having examined this monster better, the protagonist realized that it was a huge dragon, which asked how she got into the dungeon. Startled, the girl cried out. The dragon said that, having heard the question, it was necessary to answer it. Mentally, the protagonist turned to her father, to whom she said that she got into the palace of the Dragon King. The girl greeted the king and introduced herself, saying her name was Andy. The protagonist bowed to the dragon and said that she had wronged the Dragon King. The monster obviously didn't expect this and was puzzled, because usually people try to kill him and then ask for mercy. He didn't understand why the girl was looking at him like that. Andy said she was honored to meet the Dragon King, but Monster didn't understand why she thought he was a king. His name is Burkus. The main character said he is the king, with his magic-created mountains of treasure, and has been hiding from humans all this time, just like in the stories she was told. Burkus replied that he wasn't a king at all. Andy didn't understand why he was saying that. The monster assumed that the girl must be talking about the previous Dragon King. 500 years ago, the matured dragon Burkus, instead of creating his own dungeon, decided to take it from someone else. The dragon Kaiserus was the former dungeon master and strong enough to destroy an entire world. Burkus told the Dragon King that if he gave up his dungeon, he would keep him alive. Kaiserus thought these words were nonsense and wanted to chase away the petty Dragon King who dared to threaten him. Burkus killed the Dragon King with one blow. Andy was shocked by the story and said that if it was true and he really defeated the Dragon King, then he is now the new Dragon King. Burkus noticed that girl wasn't really surprised. He explained that it didn't work that way, and being a king was too much of a hassle, and he didn't need it. Dragon took a step up and asked how the girl got here after all. The main character said that she threw herself into the sea, but instead of dying, she opened her eyes and ended up here. Burkus was surprised that Andy was talking about the sea, because there were no seas near the dungeon. He thought that the girl was deceiving him, and asked how she dared to lie to the king. The dragon thought, did she really break through his protective barriers? Burkus realized that it was impossible for ordinary people to cope with such magic, but still, it was unclear if the girl had broken through. The dragon told her to stop lying to him and said that she must have some secret or special skills that helped her get here. The main character thought about her special skills. She voiced to the Dragon King that her skill was cooking. Burkus was puzzled as to what kind of nonsense this girl was talking about. The main character said that ever since she was a little girl, she had been praised for making gravy, and one woman praised her the most for it. Andy said that when she was on a part-time job, she learned that she was good at Korean pancakes and chimcha. Dragon still didn't understand how the girl got here. Andy revealed that her dad had always said that she was a good cook and that her food was always good to serve. Andy admitted how much she wanted it, her hands trembling. Other than the delicacies, she couldn't make him anything else. The dragons noticed the protagonist's trembling hands. After the words about her father, she cried and covered her eyes with her hands. Burkus thought about how noisy the girl was. He couldn't make out a single word. Andy continued to sob, and the dragon decided to go to bed, hoping that in 100 years the noise would finally disappear. He didn't know then what this particular child would bring to his life, that he could be a dragon lark. After half an hour, Andy calmed down and wondered what she was even doing in the presence of the Dragon King. The main character began to apologize for her tears as she thought about her daddy. The girl realized that the dragon was sleeping and decided to get closer. It was even bigger than it had originally seemed, even taller than her grandmother's house. Andy realized that she hadn't had breakfast yet, but looking around she didn't see anything edible. There was only gold everywhere. The dragon castle really was incredible, but the girl didn't realize where all the king's servants were. Looking around the corner, she felt the wind blowing and realized that there must be a way out, but she wasn't sure if she should go out without the king's permission. The protagonist decided that if she went out, she could meet the Dragon King's servants. As she walked a little farther, Andy saw some plants. They were the leaves of yams, also called sweet potatoes. Andy looked deeper into the vegetation, and though the leaves were small, one look was enough to realize that it was a yam, and she had never seen such a big one before. The protagonist pondered if there was any chance she had dug up some treasure, like a peach from heaven. Andy wasn't sure if she was allowed to eat something so beautiful. She figured that when the Dragon King woke up, she would definitely be hungry. The protagonist thought that if the king ate first, he would probably let her eat first too. Andy went back to the dragon. She had found food, but she didn't know how to cook it, and she couldn't give the Dragon King raw yams because you can't eat food straight from the garden. The protagonist felt Berkisi's hot breath and realized that it could be used to fry yams. Andy rummaged among the golden jewels and looked for something suitable for cooking. Everything around was very expensive and luxurious. The protagonist found a sword, and having chopped a yam on it, brought it to the flame that was bursting out of the dragon's nostrils. Andy was very hot, but she believed she could handle it all. Suddenly, Berkis woke up. He wondered if the girl was roasting the yam with the breath from his nose. The dragon thought that when he woke up, the girl wouldn't be here anymore, and here she was doing such a thing. Berkis thought maybe he should kill the guest. Andy began to apologize and explained that she wanted to cook him a delicious dish, but she had acted foolishly and rashly. The dragon told the girl that she was lying to him. The protagonist, holding a yam in her hands, asked how she would dare to cook food from his castle for herself. The girl said that she had prepared this dish for him from the bottom of her heart and asked him to try it. The dragon didn't understand what was going on because the girl could have run away, but instead, he roasted yams. He told the main character that if the dish was not tasty, he would eat her. Andy replied that in that case she would sacrifice her life to the Demon King. Even if she screamed that she wanted to live, it would hardly help. The dragon agreed to try the dish and turned into a human in a second. He held out his hand to the yam, saying it was time to eat. The main character was very surprised. Her eyes became round and wide. The Dragon King asked why Andy had such a reaction, if she didn't like the way he looked. The girl blushed and said that it wasn't like that at all. It was just that the yams were very hot, so they should be eaten carefully. The main character thought the Dragon King would turn out to be a grumpy old man, but he turned out to be handsome. The guy noticed that Andy blushed at such a small thing. He thought it was cute. The Dragon King broke off a piece of yam and tried to understand where he got such thoughts in his head, why he thought the man was cute. Maybe he didn't get enough sleep, or maybe he should just kill this girl. The protagonist was watching carefully. Andy was worried about his words, because if it was not tasty, she would only have to die. The Dragon King tasted the food prepared by the girl and realized that it tasted like ordinary yams. Berkis wondered if yams were always as sweet as honey, not even too sweet, but just right. And though this potato needed to be chewed, the texture was soft, like falling asleep under a warm plaid. It was delicious. The dragon wondered if he should ask for more, because it was delicious. He didn't know what to say to the girl, because just recently he had been furious, and if he answered the truth, his pride would be hurt. But he wanted more potatoes. The Dragon King's hand reached out to try another bite. Andy realized it looked strange, and he didn't seem to like it. Berkis said it was delicious, but he couldn't decide her fate based on one dish alone, and if she cooked something else, it would be easier to decide. The Dragon King realized that this way he wouldn't kill her and she would make more food. Andy thought that he would kill her anyway, because if you look around, there is only gold and silver, and among all the treasures she found only this yam. The main character said that you can't cook anything with gold, and how can she cook something else if there are no ingredients here? So Andy thought he wanted to kill her anyway. Berkis asked if Andy could cook something else if she had the ingredients. The girl's answer was yes. The king snapped his fingers and said he would send her to get them. At the Dragon King's call came a manticore. This creature had the body of a lion and the tail of a scorpion. Berkis told her that Manticore used to eat people, but today he would take her outside. He had very fluffy fur, so it would be a nice ride. Andy looked at the creature. It reminded her of a very large tiger. The king told her to climb on the Manticore. The protagonist was a little scared, but she realized that the creature served the Dragon King. Burkus told her not to try to trick the manticore or escape, but to come back sooner rather than later. The Dragon King suddenly realized that he had forgotten to order Manticore not to eat the girl, but calling him back was lazy. If she was going to be eaten, so be it. Burkus really wanted to sleep. The main character was riding Manticore. She assumed there would be water outside this cave, nothing to breathe. If that's the case, there's trouble. The protagonist riding the magical beast jumped out of the cave. Andy realized that they were not underwater, and there were plenty of trees and plants. The manticore stopped, and the girl climbed off it and thanked it for bringing her. It was a relief for the protagonist, because if they were underwater, things would be much more difficult. The girl realized that there would be problems with herbs for seasoning, and rice and barley. They had nothing to replace it with. Andy decided to make Korean pancakes. The pancakes could be made with wormwood and lotus root, but because of the manticore, there was dust everywhere, and Andy couldn't gather the vegetables. The creature was scratching and rubbing hard against the ground. The girl tried to figure out why it was acting this way. A few centuries ago, when the dungeon's owner had changed, Manticore had been happy that Kaiserus was finally dead, and he was really looking forward to this day after being imprisoned by him for hundreds of years. Manticore was glad that now he would be free. When Burkus came, the monster rubbed against him and thanked him for killing that bastard and freeing him. The Dragon King realized he was too lazy to care for this animal. Manticore had stayed in the dungeon, and in the hundreds of years of living in the dungeon, he had neglected himself badly: sore skin, fleas, stench. It was obvious to Andy that he was acting like an animal with dermatitis. The protagonist approached Manticore and asked if he minded if she scratched his back. The girl took a stick and started scratching the animal. The beast rejoiced because it had not experienced something like this in a long time, had not felt so relaxed. Manticore realized that this man understood him well. The girl asked where else to scratch him. Andy told her that the dermatitis wouldn't just go away and she would keep an eye on him. The creature was pleased that this man was so kind and wanted it to be that way forever. Andy realized that he liked it, and thus she had unintentionally befriended Manticore. And when they returned to the dungeon, the protagonist bathed the creature, and now he was clean. The girl had a lot of things to do. She gathered the ingredients but had nothing to cook them in. Burkus was just sleeping on the couch in the guise of a human. Andy went over to wake him up. The irritated Dragon King woke up. The girl apologized for waking him up and explained that she couldn't cook. She really wanted to finish quickly, but she had no food to cook. Burkus assumed that she was hinting at using his fire again. Andy explained that she needed a pan with a lid, a pot to knead the dough, and an oven. The Dragon King yelled that he didn't understand what that even was, and said he would sleep next, covered himself with a blanket. The main character said she couldn't make a delicious dish without all this, and he said he would kill if he didn't like it. The girl was upset because she wouldn't be able to go home and cried. The Dragon King stood up and asked what he should do in that case. Andy only asked for one small favor. It seemed to Burkus that she was trying to take advantage of him, but she was still trying to honor his task, so it was worth considering. Burkus said he didn't know the things she was talking about and told her to just use whatever the girl could find. There were still mountains of all sorts of junk around. Andy only saw gold and didn't understand where she should look. The Dragon King fell asleep again. He was incredibly difficult to deal with. Manticore heard the whole conversation and realized that a good man was in trouble. He decided that he would not let the dragon eat this girl and gently called out to her with his paw. The girl turned around and Manticore waved his paws as if trying to say something. He wanted to help the girl and asked her to follow him. In the stone corridor lay living armor. Through the magic of movement, the armor in question protected the dungeon from those who intruded. But although they move with magic, no one takes care of them. Eventually, they would rust and fall apart. For 5 centuries now, they've been good for nothing. The protagonist turned to a manticore named Daeho and asked if this was the place he was calling her to. Andy saw the armor and realized that the creature was asking her to fix it. As she got closer, the girl realized that the armor moved on its own, and this castle was really interesting. She turned to the armor and told it that she would have to bother it for a few seconds. The rope broke, but Andy thought she could tie its knot, even though it looked very old. If the girl overdid it, She might tear it again, and if she didn't reach it, it would come undone. The protagonist succeeded, and the living armor could move again. The rope was already old enough it needed to be changed in the future. The armor was glad that it could finally function and gave the girl a metal shield as a thank you. Andy looked defenseless, and this was his way of trying to thank her. Looking at the shield, the protagonist realized that it was hollow and round inside, so if the handle was removed, it would work instead of a lid. The helmet could be used as a pot, but the protagonist asked for help. Daeho was breathing fire. Thus, Andy was helped to make pancakes. She looked at the sleeping Dragon King and wondered how he would eat the pancakes. Would he eat it in one bite, or would he carefully unwrap it? What if he burned or scratched his mouth with the crispy edges? Andy wanted him to savor the dish. Opening his eyes, Burkus saw Andy. He remembered the girl's name and noticed that she looked naive, but perhaps she had ulterior motives. The protagonist borrowed a helmet from armor. The Dragon King pondered the fact that the girl's food was certainly tasty, but that was the end of it, and she couldn't fool him. He decided that he would uncover the girl's past and find out the whole truth. The protagonist chopped enough wormwood, ground lotus root and peas, added some salt from the mountaintops, and water from the fountain in the palace. Burkus looked through time and space at Andy's past life. It was the first time he had seen houses like this, and the people had strange clothes, as if from another world. Andy's father was holding a little girl in his arms and talking about how hard it was for her with a father like him. Burkus saw people in the settlement helping in Andy's family and giving food. The Dragon King saw what the little girl was doing at this late hour. She was sewing, making wood for the stove. Even when the girl was hurt, she told her father it was all right, even though her hands were bruised. A monk told Blind Shim, Andy's father, that Buddha would give him his sight back if he donated 300 bags of rice. The man was willing to do so. The protagonist gazed at her reflection in the river and thought about where to get 300 bags of rice. The men standing nearby were talking about the sea being so rough that a boat alone would not be able to get through. They were talking about some ceremony and preparations for it. There was nothing to prepare because there was no sacrificial food and no man willing to give his life for 300 bags of rice. Andy ran up to the men who were talking on the shore and asked what they had just been talking about. All the protagonist cared about was that her father would now be able to get his sight back. Her father had once told the protagonist that there was a huge dragon king living in the Indansu Sea, his palace filled with gold and silver jewelry, and there were also servants who served the king. The girl threw herself into the sea in the name of returning sight to her father. Now Burkus knew about everything that happened to this young girl who continued to make him food. He thought it was foolish to jump into the sea for such a reason. In the dragon's opinion, the people in the village were very different, and now it was clear why Andy called him king. She didn't even know how to lie. Andy said they could make into pancakes now. She put the shield that Armor had gotten for the girl on the fire, and when it was heated enough, she put the pancakes in there, pressing them down with her hands so the shape would be better. The Dragon King was awake, pondering what an unsweet life this girl had. Andy remembered how her father liked the crispy edges. She wanted to believe that her father was doing well and not to worry. When the protagonist finished cooking, she approached the king, who was pretending as if he had just woken up. The girl presented the lotus root pancakes. After looking at them, the dragon said they looked strange. The protagonist said that it was a dish she made in the spring in her town, and it was very tender and savory. In this dish, the girl put all her heart, so she asked to try it for sure. The Dragon King suspected that this dish would be even more delicious than the previous one. Suddenly, Andy's eyes swam and she fainted, but Burkus caught her. The weakened girl was talking about how she still hadn't heard the king's decision. Burkus put Andy on the couch and asked how long she'd been working. The protagonist laughed and said she didn't know. She kept repeating the same thing and didn't understand at all what was going on. The Dragon King didn't understand why he was acting like this with this girl, but put his palm on her head. Andy took his hand and asked if she could go home now. Burkus asked if she could head back on her own. Even before jumping into the water, the girl thought about it. It was very hard for her now. Burkus covered Andy with a blanket, sat down beside her, and began to taste what she had prepared. He thought that next time he shouldn't treat her like that, though he should keep the girl close to him to make good food. The Dragon King, after tasting the pancake, realized that it was oversalted And, in that case, he wouldn't be able to understand the real taste of the dish. He decided to try another piece, and it too turned out to be salty. In a village nearby, the local feudal lord, the tax collector, gathered all the locals. There were about 50 people, and it was a small fraction of the population. The overseer was told that because of soft-hearted people like him, things had gotten even more messy. The feudal tax collector was kneeling before the ruler, who told him that the taxes collected were far less than they should be. The locals were running away and not paying their taxes. The feudal lord promised to personally catch every last one of those lousy people who had run away and collect the remaining money. The ruler said that no matter where they ran away to, they were still locals and should be punished according to the law. The feudal lord realized that it was worth it to fulfill the errand and catch up with the villagers who had fled. He began a canvass. Everyone had to introduce themselves to him, and those who refused to comply with the order would be killed. One of the locals stood up and said he was the head man. The feudal lord said that if he lived here, he had to pay taxes, because it was a sacred duty and had to be done. And if he was so irresponsible, he would be judged to the full extent of the law. The local resident replied that because of the bad harvest, their children are starving and the taxes have increased 5 times. Even if they all add up, the amount is still huge. They don't know what to do. The headman was grabbed by a mob of guards and beat him badly. The feudal lord said he didn't come here to listen to their excuses. He said that a bad harvest, starving children, were all excuses, and they should have worked harder for the sake of the governor. Through loyalty and obedience, they should work day and night. The feudal lord said they should have worked harder. They end up sleeping all night, eating, and say they can't pay their taxes. The villagers can't get away from this. One woman said that no matter how hard they work, the outcome is always the same. The feudal lord said that lack of effort, lack of enthusiasm, should only cause anger in one's own direction. He drew his sword and said that they were all accused of tax evasion and desertion, and they would be punished. All the crops would be taken away, and the village would be finished. The man raised his sword up and said that was the end of it. There was despair in the eyes of the people. At that moment, Andy arrived on Manticore and apologized for distracting them while they were talking. A few hours ago, Andy had been busy cleaning the dungeon. Burkus irritably asked to let him finally get some sleep. The girl replied that the sun had been up for a long time. The king said that the sun rises every day. The protagonist tried to convey that as the sun rises, people should wake up. Burkus replied that he wasn't human, so he could sleep as long as he wanted, but that the noise was keeping him awake. After Andy passed out, she slept and felt much better. The girl thought the king would be hungry when he woke up, so she left some pancakes just in case, but she was hungry and decided to eat some too. After taking a bite, the girl then had to drink 5 mugs of water in one gulp because they were oversalted, which made Andy very embarrassed, and she blushed. Burkus said that cleaning is good, but not to the same extent, because she had just put things away and stacked all the treasures. The protagonist said that she was going to clean the Dragon King's room as well. He replied that that was enough, and asked if the girl had gotten enough sleep before cleaning. Andy replied that she had gotten about 8 hours of sleep. Burkus was outraged that the girl had only allotted 8 hours, 480 minutes, 28800 seconds for sleep. Normally, by dragon standards, when it came to sleep, dragons would fall asleep for at least 10, and when they woke up, they would say a good nap. Burkus was surprised that the girl had only gotten 8 hours of sleep. He thought that couldn't happen, and that's why humans live less than 100 years. Andy said that not sleeping enough was bad too. The Dragon King realized that now the girl would always make that much noise, but even so, if he killed her, it would break his promise and he would lose his dragon power. The main character was tired of the stupid cleaning, but she couldn't turn a blind eye to it all. The Dragon King realized that he had to think of something to distract Andy from cleaning. Using magic, he created a bunch of candy and told the girl that it was candy and it was hard. If you put it in your mouth, it would melt. The main character watched and tried to understand how the king could create such miracles. Burkus suggested that the girl make some herself. It didn't matter how good a cook she was, she wouldn't be able to replicate it in this dungeon. Andy didn't want to die and realized that she apparently had no choice. The king realized in order to make the candy, Andy would have to stop cleaning and then he could sleep. The main character realized that the Dragon King wanted her to make rice caramel. It sounded strange to him, but he realized that was what it was called in Andy's homeland. The Dragon King didn't care what it was called. He wanted the girl to make this candy right here. Andy told him that to make flour you need barley or wheat. She hadn't seen anything like that in the palace and didn't understand where to find it. The main character tried to understand why the king set such difficult tasks for her. He didn't listen to the girl at all and went back to sleep, saying he would wake up when she cooked the dish. Manticore was already by the girl's side and came before he was called. Andy said it would be great to find the ingredients for the rice caramel somewhere. Daeho knew where to go and asked the girl to trust him. Andy, riding Manticore, arrived at the settlement and was glad to see there was a town with people. The feudal lord was shocked to see that this lion was the size of an elephant. It had huge paws that if stepped on would be certain death. Feudal was worried about being in this position. He felt that he had to stay calm. He couldn't just die like this. The man heard a voice coming from upstairs. Andy asked Manticore to lower himself a little, and the man could see that there was a man sitting on top. He realized that a person couldn't ride something like that, especially a little girl like that. A little girl dressed in strange clothes, riding a monster, and even saying hello politely, is definitely a witch. The protagonist gently descended to the ground and apologized for distracting from the important meeting. The girl revealed that she was the daughter of the Shim family and her name was Andy. She asked the man if he was the village chief. The protagonist said that she came here with a request. The man was very scared. He thought he was finished if it was a witch. Andy asked the feudal lord if he could explain the reason why he was holding a sword. The man didn't understand why she was asking that. He didn't know if he should tell the truth and confess that he was trying to kill all those people. The feudal realized that if he said something bad, he would provoke this witch, and if he lied, she would kill him. The man said the reason he was holding the sword was because of the wolf. Andy asked if it was a mountain wolf or not. The feudal lord was already glad that he managed to fool the witch and said that, lately, wolves have been frequent. So when he heard about the terrible condition in the town, you get worried. The protagonist was glad that this man, it turns out, had good intentions and thought about how difficult it must have been for the locals. The feudal lord realized that if the girl found out that he had lied to her, she would kill him. Andy heard that the mountain wolf steals not only pets, but even small children. The girl suggested building a strong fence around the town, because if it was high enough, the wolf would definitely not get through here. The man didn't understand what it had to do with him, but replied that it was a great idea. The feudal lord was afraid that if he didn't fulfill the witch's wish, something would happen to him, so he turned to the men and told them to start soon. He tried to convey somehow that it was the witch, and if they didn't want to die, they needed to move faster. The men started to make a fence. After a while, they were very tired and wanted to rest, but they realized that if they were caught idling, this monster would kill them, or they would become the witch's test subjects. All the people wanted to live and realized that they needed to finish that fence. In the end, only half a day later, the fence was finally completed. The protagonist didn't think they would get it done so quickly. The feudal lord hoped that after this, the witch would leave him alone. Andy said that because of the help they had given her was a little embarrassing, but asked her to give her some ingredients to cook with. The feudal laughed and said it was no problem. Then he wondered why she needed the ingredients for food, for what she wanted to use them for, or who could feed that huge monster. The protagonist replied that she would need to juice it. The man was horrified as he imagined this very juice being squeezed out of him. He immediately remembered his mother, with whom he was ready to meet in heaven, and lost consciousness. The protagonist and Manticore returned to the dungeon. She reflected on the fact that she had made that mister very worried. The people of this town had almost nothing, but they still gave some ingredients. Noble people. The protagonist thanked Manticore for his help and was very happy that he had helped catch a wild boar for them. The people had helped his dear man, so he thought he should return the favor and brought the wild boar in return. Now the inhabitants will not starve, and Andy, having settled all his affairs, will be able to do the dough. The main character was running in different directions with a pot in her hand. Berkey stopped the girl and asked her what she was doing now, for she had been running around with that pot since yesterday. He assumed she might be eating something without it. The girl smiled and opened the pot, which had just water in it. She explained that when wheat seeds are in heat, they get hot and sprout, and to prevent that from happening, they had to put them in cold water to make dough later. In the Dragon King's imagination, the words about heating the seeds looked very strange. He asked the main character if she was a farmer. In fact, this girl could only pick peppers, lettuce leaves, onions, corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, radishes, sesame leaves, garlic, barley, wheat, rice, millet, and peas. Burkus thought the girl was incredible and said she should be called a super farmer. Andy replied that she was working hard to make rice caramel for our Dragon King. It became clear that this was all done so he could eat more caramel. Burkus said that one thing he was worried about was how long she would keep doing all this. The Dragon King turned his attention to the girl's hands. They were all scarred, scratched. He remembered that when she had gone to make candy, her hands had been fine. The girl replied that she had 5 days to finish everything. Burkus was angry and realized that this was a problem because he wouldn't be able to sleep for 5 whole days, and he would be bothered by her hands because he had made the girl do it so easily, on her own. The Dragon King felt that Andy should not overexert herself so that she wouldn't pass out like last time. He couldn't even take a nap, so worried about this girl. Andy advised the king to rest, and when she was done, she promised to wake him up. Burkus was trying to figure out why the girl was so cheerful and why he even cared so much about any human being. The Dragon King tried to sleep, but only Andy's hands, covered with wounds and scratches, appeared in his thoughts. He admitted to himself, though, that he was really worried about this girl. The main character continued cooking and the malt was ready. Now she had to get the main ingredient. The girl decided that sweet potatoes would be a great option. In order to cook these sweet potatoes, a bigger pot was needed. Andy assumed that if she cut it into pieces, it should fit, but steaming would take all the flavor out. The protagonist pondered what she should do next. Andy looked at the huge yams and thought that it would be nice to have a wok like she had at home. The girl realized that she was always in debt to Daeho, and this time she would manage on her own. Thus began Andy's adventures in the palace. A few days ago, the protagonist found herself in a room full of jewelry. Manticore knew that dragons liked jewelry. The protagonist asked Daeho about the other rooms, and if they had the same huge amount of jewelry in them. Manticore's answer was negative, and he showed the girl another room that had a large amount of paintings hanging in it. People used to live in this castle, and they were the ones who hung them. The huge lion couldn't even eat all these paintings, and he didn't understand why such a thing would be collected. Andy looked closely and noticed only one painting that was not decorated. The protagonist reached out her hand for this painting that was different from the others. Manticore stopped her. Since Andy didn't understand his speech, she thought he was angry because she was touching objects in the palace. The girl apologized and promised not to do it again. Manticore tapped his paws on the floor, for the girl did not understand him. He pulled her back a little and showed her that if she touched this painting, the floor beneath it would fall through. It was dangerous to touch anything here. The protagonist realized that Daeho was saving her. She bowed and thanked the animal. He was grateful to her too, because if it wasn't for the girl, he would have been in a lot of trouble. He remembered the bath time as Andy washed him. Manticore also remembered the pleasant moments of brushing and sleeping. He realized that without this girl, all of that might be gone. Daeho decided that he would guide the protagonist through all the traps. Andy didn't understand what the animal was talking about, but she trusted him completely. Manticore showed all the traps that were in this castle. The protagonist realized that something bad could have happened, but even so, she was very glad that Manticore gave her a tour of the palace. Soon he fell asleep. The protagonist realized that if she hadn't been told about all the traps, she wouldn't have been able to walk around so carelessly. After walking around the castle for a while, the girl realized that something like a cauldron was unlikely to be found here. There were only statues everywhere. The main character decided to go look in the other rooms and was already opening the door, as suddenly she heard some sound behind her back. She turned around and asked if anyone else was here. The Dragon King lay on the couch and thought about how quiet it was around him. And even yesterday, Andy was running all over the room. He wanted to know for sure that the girl was all right, he reassured himself, because he had a little more healing magic. A bee flew in and told Burkus that someone was trapped. He asked the bee to check for him what had happened. The king could see through the insect's eyes, and, judging by the vibration and direction, made his way to where Andy was. He didn't understand what she was even doing there. The elusive gargoyle killer. It's a monster that pretends to be a statue and attacks an opponent from behind. 500 years ago, when the owner of the dungeon changed, the dragon realized that Manticore and the gargoyle lived there, which expressed a desire to continue protecting the place and stayed in the dungeon. Burkus felt that having the creature amongst something that resembled her would be of more use. The creature was expecting humans, though then perhaps it should have escaped. But as a result, it met no humans and stood in the form of a statue for 500 years. The statue cried and begged to come here and save it. The protagonist approached the gargoyle and said that her name was Andy, and she had recently started serving the Dragon King and asked him to take care of her. But the statue only cried in response. The protagonist suggested that Mr. Statue might have something ailing him. Manticore and the armor were also having problems. Andy asked if anything was hurting the gargoyle, but she kept crying in response. Steam trap. If you activate water and fire magic at the same time, hot steam will form. Andy picked up a rock from the floor, hoping it would be enough. A long time ago, when the grandmother of the main character was very sick, her granddaughter had applied compresses to her. But everyone around her thought that it wouldn't do any good. The grandmother asked the girl to leave her until she herself became ill. In the end, the grandmother left this world. Her taking care of her grandmother was not a waste of time, so as long as she cared, the gargoyle would be fine. Andy was sure it would work and threw the stone at the gargoyle with all her might. At this moment, the Dragon King was watching everything going on with the eyes of a bee. He thought Andy was making caramel and didn't understand why the girl was doing all this to the gargoyle. Now the creature was no longer a statue and could move again. Andy was very happy that she was able to free the gargoyle and told it not to waste much energy. The creature decided that she would be sure to thank the girl. Now it didn't care about the dungeon. It decided to protect Andy. The protagonist realized that with the help of steam, she could bake sweet potatoes. Andy and the gargoyle together found a solution to the problem. Soon, the girl presents the king with a big, beautiful caramel. The protagonist decided that this time she will use Manticore's fire. Since the temperature is high, the caramel can stick together, so you need to constantly watch the fire. The Dragon King, lying on the couch, watched the main heroine. Now she was doing what needed to be done, and he couldn't wait to see what would happen. He was very interested, but he took another nap. When Burkes woke up, he saw that Andy was here and still continuing to cook. He hoped the girl would wake him when she was done, and decided he could sleep a little longer. Dawn came. The Dragon King opened his eyes and saw Andy still cooking. He didn't realize how much time had passed, or how long he had been asleep. It seemed that the girl hadn't moved at all since that moment. Burkes had no idea that making candy was so difficult. The main character had finally finished. She was sure she had done it right now. Last time, the girl wasn't sure if the king liked her food. Andy woke Burkus up and offered to answer the caramel. The main character brought him a dish of food and said that she tried very hard and didn't know if he would like the taste. The king sternly replied that if she did, she would be in trouble, though inside he was impatient to know what the food tasted like. Andy didn't understand how she could forget. Anyway, she tried not to even think about it, but still thoughts of how the king could eat her came to mind. Andy reasoned aloud that if the Dragon King thought she was just an ingredient, did that mean he would boil her or roast her or bake her, maybe just eat her raw? Burkus was shocked at these words, for he had just wanted to scare the girl, and it turned out she had thought so much about it. The king reached over to the dish and tasted the caramel that had been prepared for him. The color was plain, and the texture was pleasant. A local feudal lord sat at the bar and shared with others that he had never seen such a fearsome creature, and even with a lion that was bigger than an elephant. He talked about how this witch, with a face like that, really had no problem taking someone's life. People were trying to figure out what to do next. One of the men asked not to panic and said that for the sake of protecting honesty and justice in this world, he would gladly sacrifice his life and kill the witch. The main character was watching the Dragon King, who was trying to bite into a caramel. The girl advised him not to worry, chew slowly, and the candy will melt in his mouth. The more chewed, the more it would thicken. Burkus felt that the caramel was sweet, but as it began to melt, there was an incredible flavor. It was very appetizing, something similar to sweet potatoes, but a little different. The main character said that she learned how to make this caramel from her grandmother's secret recipe in the neighborhood, but her skills are much worse than her grandmother's. The king marveled and said that it was really quite edible. The king could hardly restrain himself from saying that it was delicious and impressive. The protagonist tried to understand what he meant. Burkus replied that it was too early to make a final decision and he needed another dish to evaluate it better. Andy remarked that he kept saying the same thing, that it was a hoax. Burkus didn't understand how she guessed and needed to come up with something immediately. The king said going to the girl's home village. He admitted that he was so worried that Andy had misunderstood him and stroked the girl's head, asking her to believe him. The dragon said that the location of the village wasn't supposed to change. He regretted telling the girl about the village, but realized that he needed to take responsibility for his words. The protagonist apologized for not being able to help him. Burkus said it would be okay and he would handle it. The king remembered that it shouldn't be too far away. He lay back down on a huge rock. Andy stood next to it and said she would guard the king. In return, Burkus promised he would be back soon. The Demon King's soul rose above his body and he took off. Manticore watched him closely. Burkus hoped that while he was gone, nothing would happen. It was snowing. The knight who had expressed a desire to kill the witch watched from the sidelines. A little girl stood next to the monster. It all came together. She was indeed a witch that wandered in the daylight. From behind, he saw a young man lying on a rock and decided it was her victim. The knight felt sorry that such a young man was lying here as a sacrifice. He realized that the rumors were true, thus the witch was preserving her youth, and he would not allow this to continue. The knight threw something at the girl, took the king in his arms, and shouted that he would save him from such a fate. Burkus arrived at the village. He noticed the clothes too and thought it was the right place. Now the king needed to find Andy's father's house, but he couldn't ask anyone, because no one had actually seen him. The Dragon King sat on the porch and pondered how to find Shim's house. A huge dog barked at him instead of trying to help him. From inside the house, someone's voice was saying that since he was here, why didn't he come in? Burkus didn't realize at first that it was him being addressed. The voice continued to say that he had come here because he longed for answers to his questions. As he entered the house, the Demon King was surprised that it was some unusual person because he could see him. The master of the house told the guest to sit down. The king replied that he could stand and asked where Huangjun's house was. The master of the house said that here were rituals, secrets of fortune, love spells, and all kinds of talismans, and he should be glad that he had found a shamaness like her who could control spells as well as give good luck. Burkus showed himself, and the shamaness fell to the floor in horror, screaming that the place was haunted. She threw rice from him and told him to disappear and go away. The king left the house and realized that she was a common charlatan and he had only wasted his time. A drunken guy walked by and caught King's arm and apologized to him. Burkus replied that you shouldn't drink if you don't know how. He looked petty. Then, the dragon suddenly realized he had been seen. The Dragon King sat down on the bench to this guy and asked if he could see him. This man's reaction was unpredictable. He fell off the bench and then started to run away quickly. He didn't realize what was happening or who it was that was sitting with him just now. The drunk guy thought he was hallucinating and started to run away abruptly, not realizing who had just sat with him. Burkus grabbed the guy and asked him if he could see him. The stranger screamed even louder, and then the Dragon King said that if he kept screaming he would take his soul, and the guy fell silent. Burkus explained that nothing would happen if he answered his questions. The Dragon King wanted to know the way. The lad advised him to go straight ahead and then cross the river twice. Burkus promised the lad a gift for helping him. This drunken stranger's name was Hongil Dong. The dragon told him that he would transfer his charms to his left arm and also to his right arm. If he practiced for a year, he could use magic 3 times a day. Hong was terrified and didn't realize what was happening. Ghost touched his back with his hands. A burning sensation was felt. From that moment on, Hong Gil-dong's life changed. Burkus found Andy's ancestral home. Upon entering it, he saw that the house was in bad condition. The girl's father was sitting on the floor drawing pictures while saying his daughter's name out loud. A woman entered the room and shouted at the old man that he was at it again, and the girl would not come back so easily. She snatched the brush from the old man's hands and told him to forget everything and live happily ever after. The man called the woman his mom, Peng Doc. She resented it and said she was unlucky. Berkes watched from the sidelines and didn't understand what kind of scene was going on right now. Andy asked the knight who attacked them to bring back the Dragon King. He replied that he wouldn't do that and wouldn't let this guy be a victim. The main character kept repeating that he was the Dragon King. The knight said that the Dragon King's name is Cojotus. The protagonist explained that his name was Berkes. The knight didn't want to hear all this and told her not to lie to him, for even a 3-year-old child knew the story, that the true Dragon King in this cave was Cojotus. The guy with the sword told the girl that she would not deceive him by using such a silly name, and if it was all true, he would agree to wear a flower in his hair for the rest of his life. At that moment, a dragon's voice came from behind him, asking what he should do with his name now. A few hours before Berkes returned, Knight threw balloons at Manticore and Andy that were made of super spicy peppers from Mexico, blue onion concentrate, and garlic. It was a saliva gas that combined all the bad stuff. The knight said that the witch's strength didn't matter, as there was no way to avoid it all. He wanted to save that man while the witch was distracted, but there was a problem in his plan. Andy just needed the ingredients for the seasoning. They showed up at just the right moment. The protagonist approached the knight and asked how much he was selling hot peppers for. The witch was a girl from the Joseon dynasty, trained in cooking, homemaking. The guy pushed the girl away, grabbed Berkes, who was lying on a rock, and rushed off. The protagonist looked after the knight did not understand why he took the king. The girl did not know what she should do now. Cheaters often impersonated others to steal people. Even if the king woke up somewhere else, any place he could sleep would be suitable for him, and he might not even come back. The girl urged Manticore to urgently go save the king, but Daeho refused and said he had no reason to save that lazy man. Andy begged a lot, and as a result, she managed to persuade Manticore. Berkes told the knight who stole his body that calling him by his first name was a ridiculous idea. The guy was horrified to discover that she was really a dragon, and this was his chance to protect humanity and become famous in history. The knight drew his sword and lunged towards Berkes, screaming at him that he was evil in the flesh. The guy threatened to chop his head off and bring peace to the world. The dragon didn't understand why he was acting like this. The truth was that this man only looked like a savior, but in reality was quite different. The young knight crouched under a tree to get a drink of water. Hidden, 3 girls were watching him and discussing where he was from, and maybe they should go over and talk to the handsome man. He was just drinking water, but he looked incredibly cool, and the girls admired him. This knight's name was Michael, and he worked as a courier. One day, when he was wasting his time on a stupid job as he always did, he was attacked by 3 robbers and told to get everything valuable that he had. The guy menacingly asked the brigands if they had made the wrong choice. The attackers noticed that he had changed somehow and suggested that he might be some kind of hero. Michael realized that they were just brigands. If he walked a little further, he could already see the village. He couldn't lose the package. The guy, menacingly, without a tremor in his voice, told the brigands that he was giving them a chance to escape, but if not, they wouldn't survive. The attackers were frightened, apologized, and ran away. His lie worked, and he considered it luck. One day, the bandits came to the village and announced that the village was now theirs. Michael spoke to the attackers again, and they hurriedly left the village. Thus, people began to call him a hero, and he began to consider himself one. Michael was now on his knees before the Dragon King, the main heroine and Manticore. He admitted that he kept telling himself that one day he would save the world and called himself a hero. But the more he thought that, the more disappointed and sorry he became. He realized that he wasn't and realized that he had fooled everyone. The knight said that he didn't want to be a hero and then suffer and feel shame. He was always tormented by thoughts of why he was born in this world and what he should do. Berkes said that he thinks about strange things, and he was just born and should just live. The knight thought it was better to die than to live for no reason and asked to kill him now so he could get payback for everything. The Dragon King said he didn't want to do that and wouldn't. Michael said it was an honor to die at the hands of a dragon. He asked that he be rewarded with a heroic death. Burkus said he wouldn't do it. He had no reason to worry about such things. Michael was disappointed, realizing that even in death, he could not become a hero. The Dragon King told the knight to pull himself together and said the girl had something to tell him. The protagonist crouched down on the ground closer to Michael and asked if he was okay, calling him a hero. The knight didn't believe her words, thinking the girl was a witch. She talked about not being so careless about life, wishing herself dead out of futility. Andy did not think it was right to his parents, who gave him life. The protagonist took Michael by the hand and asked him to taste her dish and think it over again. The knight was puzzled as to why the witch was offering to taste her dish. The protagonist climbed her feet into the river looking for a suitable stone. Burkus pondered on how he should tell the girl about the news from home, because even if he explained, nothing would change the fact that she could not return. The protagonist had found the right stone. Burkus realized that Andy would miss home even more, and a promise are not just words, and he must tell her the whole truth. The Dragon King decided that he could tell the girl everything later, when he had time. The main character found a black snail in the river, or said that if you look closely, there is edible meat inside. Burkus said that this amount of food would not be enough. The girl explained that it could be cooked as well, but in this case she would cook with other ingredients. Michael, looking at the snail, realized in horror that they were going to cook this and eat it. Burkus asked the knight if he would be picky about the food they would share with him. The boy jumped up and ran to the girl, asking if there was anything he could do to help. The main character said that the water in the river was cold enough and told the knight to rest, and even though she was doing everything by herself, and even in the icy water. Michael was now dubbed the hero. Andy turned to him and asked if she could use the pot he had in his bag. The knight gladly gave it all up, and the protagonist was happy that the pot had finally been found. Burkus asked Andy if she was done. The girl replied that the snails still needed to be rinsed and leaving them in the water. That way she would get all the unnecessary stuff out of them. Time had to be given so that all the debris and grains of sand would end up on the bottom. The Dragon King asked the girl if she would make him mess with them. The protagonist replied that if they didn't do it, they wouldn't be able to cook anything. They would smell bad if they weren't washed well. They needed to rinse them 3 times at 2-hour intervals. Andy said she was going into the woods to collect pine needles. No one understood why they needed the needles, but the girl said they would come in handy. The main character climbed Manticore and promised to return soon. The Dragon King tried to figure out when the girl would rest, but she ran back and forth and said she'd pick some more vegetables and come back, and off she went again. Burkus didn't understand why it was so complicated and so much preparation. Andy thanked her for her concern and said she would be back as soon as she had enough food to cook. The cooking process continued. Michael was asleep, and the king reflected on the fact that the girl had not yet sat down once since his return, and with this night, it was nothing but trouble. Burkus was trying to think of a way to get rid of him. The main character said she could rest now, because the snails would be cleaned overnight and could be boiled in the morning. But instead of resting, Andy went back to doing something. Burkus, watching Andy, asked what she was doing. The girl explained that it would be chilly at night, so she was making a fire. The protagonist said, "As the fate of the country lies in the hands of the king, so the health of the Dragon King depends on those who serve him in the palace," and told the king to rest. Burkus realized that the girl was not even listening to him. She told him not to worry because she was almost done. The Dragon King grabbed Andy by the shoulders and pulled her aside. With a snap of his fingers, he made the fire burn and said that now the protagonist could go to rest. Michael was glad he had brought a sleeping bag. Burkus walked over and pulled out the sleeping bag he was lying on and said it was for him and told the knight to go sleep off to the side, as there was plenty of room around. The knight found himself in the clutches of Manticore, who licked him. Burkus noticed that the girl was doing something by the fire again instead of resting. He went over and asked why she wasn't resting. Andy replied that she was afraid the fire might go out. The Dragon King covered the girl with a plaid and advised her to do what he said, that is to go to rest, or she would get sick again and oversalt the food. The girl was worried that if she didn't watch the fire, it would go out and the king would freeze. Burkus hugged the girl and offered to sit like this. The two of them were warm and cozy. The king was about to fall asleep, but he noticed that the girl was waiting for him to close his eyes. Suddenly, Burkus became very indignant and said that if she stayed up all night, she would lose all knowledge like last time. The king was indignant. "I said that the girl should do as he said, and if he said sleep, she should sleep, because if she fainted, there would be no one to cook their snails." Andy laughed in response. Burkis told the girl to go back to sleep immediately. Michael was already asleep on the warm manticore. Only the Dragon King and Andy were left to fall asleep. They wished each other good night and went to bed. The next morning, Andy continued cooking, and when she was done, she presented a black snail salad. She told the knight that it was only because of his seasoning that something like this could be prepared. The dish looked very appetizing, and he wondered what it would taste like. Michael tasted a bite and felt that all the ingredients went together, although he thought it was impossible to cook them. But after washing and cleaning, it turned out to have a gorgeous flavor. Michael had never practiced properly before because he was considered a real hero as it was. He ate the dish and said it was really good and apologized. Andy said that she had already forgotten everything but one thing. The main character reminded that there is an expression that a man should keep his word. It means that a man's words are valuable as long as they are true. Michael said that he would wear a flower for the rest of his life if the Dragon King's name was really Burkis. Since there were no flowers on hand, they decided to use a pine cone, and now Michael had to wear it. The protagonist asked that when he returned to town, he should pin the flower to his hair. Manticore and Burkis chuckled at the night. Michael headed home. Andy waved after him and told him to be careful. The Dragon King approached the girl and said they needed to talk about her hometown since he was back. Burkus wanted to ask the protagonist if she was happy here in the palace. Andy looked at the dragon in bewilderment. He said that if she wanted to live among humans, she could go. The king understood that she would be better off that way than with the monsters. The protagonist looked at Burkus carefully and said she would stay with him. The king was outraged because he had given her a choice and she had made her decision so quickly. Andy said that she had become his servant and now he should be responsible for her future. The girl confessed to the king that she enjoyed cooking for him the most. Burkus said that, in that case, there was nothing he could do, and he should tell everything. The Dragon King said that when he was in Andy's hometown, he found her father's house and the woman who was with him. The girl, hearing all of this, silently went off in another direction somewhere else. Burkis realized that perhaps he should have lied after all. Manticore looked angrily at the king, while he reasoned that perhaps he should teach the girl the magic of displacement, and if they started now, they would still be able to see him. Burkus saw a large bush with flowers and ran towards it, and said that they had better find that flower before Michael left. Burkis was very surprised that they had seen the flowers in this weather, and suggested that someone might have used magic on them. Andy revealed that they were camellia flowers, and told them about the expression, "the heart that cannot be changed." It was an expression that described a person whose heart would remain true to the end. It meant that a pure heart would not move no matter what the reason, would endure the bitter cold, would bloom with bright colors, and those colors would nourish the camellia flowers. In the town of the protagonist, it was said that if a couple found this flower together, they would be blessed by the heavens themselves and die together in love. Burkis said that they found this flower together. Realizing what had happened, they both blushed. The Dragon King, feeling awkward, abruptly went the other way and started changing the subject, asking about the taste of snails. Burkus said the flavor was not clear, and the girl asked why his face was so red. The Dragon King turned to the protagonist and said it was nothing like that, and it was the girl's face that had gotten so red, not his. Andy replied that the cold wind was to blame, and she was much cooler than he was. Burkis said that it was very cold indeed, and the two of them were red in the face from the cold. They must be very cold, so it was time to go back to the palace. The king took Andy's hand, and they set off. For the first time in his life, Burkis stopped hating the morning sun. Back at the palace, the protagonist thanked Manticore, Gargoyle, and Armor for their help, and said she had prepared a treat especially for them. But Gargoyle had no throat, Armor was hollow inside, and Manticore was a predator. The protagonist decided Daeho would go first and held out a mushroom pancake to him. He hadn't eaten anything but meat, but still, it was food from a girl. Everyone pretended that it was delicious to them. The main character said they would now try namul, this appetizer made from leaves boiled or spiced fresh. The Dragon King was asleep on his couch, and the protagonist was busy cleaning the palace. Berkus felt that only a year or just a month of restful sleep was needed. After the trip, it was necessary to rest. The dragon didn't understand how the girl could keep working so hard. The Dragon King irritably jumped up from the couch and said they needed to talk. He said to clean up when it was already dirty. In that case, there was still something to clean up. But if she was just going to retaliate, it wouldn't make any difference. No one would notice anything. The king went on to say that it's a shame when you try for nothing, so as soon as it gets messy, that's when you should clean up. He told the girl to wait until it got a little dirtier, and then her work wouldn't be for nothing. Berkus felt that Andy was not listening to him at all, and he threw a coin on the floor to get Andy's attention. The king asked what the girl was thinking about. The protagonist replied that she was thinking about making meja, which is a fermented dried ground pea stacked in a square mold. The king didn't know what it was. The girl explained that it was an important ingredient in making different sauces, and she would be able to make more dishes for him with 3 basic sauces: red pepper paste, soybean paste, and soy sauce. The main character talked about how she had to work hard so he wouldn't eat her. The king indignantly asked how she even came up with such a thing. The girl reminded him that he himself had told her that if it wasn't tasty, she would be eaten. The king asked what Andy would make sauces out of. The protagonist said that she had found some soybeans to cook with, but just having the right products wasn't easy to cook and would need a whole special appliance. The girl wondered where she could find one. Berkus didn't understand why the girl was asking him about it. Andy replied that maybe he could help her and give her a hint. The king realized that of course he could create something with magic, but he didn't know what it looked like, and if he left the girl, she would continue her noisy cleaning again. The king replied that there was a way, but only one way. Andy tensed up and asked what it was about. Berkus told her to listen carefully. In this dungeon lived a lizard that lets out fire. Her name is Salamander. If she finds her, she can make the right device. Andy realized that just like the king said, there must be a lizard here. If she didn't find it today, she would have to give up. The protagonist was helped by her monster friends to search. Suddenly, they found the very same salamander. Noticing the alien's gaze on her, the lizard thought that if they saw her like that, they would mock her and rush to run away. Andy motioned for her to stop and asked if she was Salamander by any chance. The lizard was becoming and turned to the main character. A salamander that has beautiful fire as a decoration, she may be tiny, but she always wins. Defeated until that day 500 years ago. On that day, some strange dragon took over the dungeon and stayed to live in it. The salamander waited to be given a flower, and her flame was dwindling due to hunger. One day she saw a man who just ignored her, and she decided that once she recovered, she would teach that man a lesson. But the flame she was waiting for did not come back. The main character realized what had happened, and it didn't matter what flower was needed. By eating it, the salamander would get her flame back. Andy picked up the lizard and took it outside. There were so many flowers around, and he couldn't get enough of them. The main character didn't know what to do, but she was sure that the king would know exactly how to solve this problem. The girl ran to Berkus with the words that there was a disaster. He woke up and asked in horror what had happened. Andy told him that Salamander couldn't eat the flowers. Berkus did not understand what nonsense the girl was saying, and why would Salamander eat flowers? The girl held a lizard in her hands and said there was a problem, and it was the same salamander lizard he was telling about. Taking the creature in his arms, the king realized that it was very different. The girl told him that the lizard had lost its powers due to starvation. The protagonist explained that this was not all, and the salamander could not eat regardless of the type of flower, but would only eat if it tasted good. King replied to Andy that she was the one who was good on the subject of tasty and edible. King reminded about cooking, but didn't understand if it was possible to just cook the flowers. He thought the flavor would be weird. The protagonist suggested to Berkus that this time they cook the dish together. In Andy's hometown, when the flowers on the peaks bloom, the residents call for an auspicious year by cooking hwajeon from azalea leaves, and then everyone gathers together. The king wanted to affirmatively say that he wouldn't do that, but he noticed that all the monsters were helping the girl. Andy said that even if just one person put their whole heart into this dish, it would have an effect. Berkey's explained that he wasn't human. The girl said that if Salamander's condition didn't improve and she continued to starve, she would die. The king couldn't refuse the girl and agreed. Berkey tried very hard. He thought that he should finish quickly and go to bed, and this way Andy would not be upset and they could solve the problem. The main character watched the king and how he was trying and was very surprised. The king was surprised at the process of making the dough and noticed his place a complete mess and Andy completely clean, and asked if she had put something in his dough. The main character replied that of course not, and they used the same ingredients. Berkey was horrified that he, a mighty dragon, couldn't handle this. He thought there was no way this could happen and decided to use his magic power. Andy stopped him and told him that it couldn't be done that way and it was dangerous. The main character took the king's hand in hers and said that now they would knead the dough together. The girl told him that they had to do it gently, with their fingertips, so that it would be soft. Berkey realized that Andy had noticed how he wanted to use magic. The king started to get good at it, and the main character praised him. Berkey turned up his nose and said that there was nothing he couldn't do. Andy replied that she didn't doubt him, and he figured it out very quickly. The girl continued to marvel and talk about what an incredible king. The main characters continued to prepare the dishes. A fire was lit, and the dough turned into a black lump made by the king with all his soul. The girl took this nook in her hands and said that she saw such a thing for the first time, but she was sure that it was not the dough. The protagonist tore a piece off her dough and suggested that the king talk to him this time before cooking. Berkey didn't understand why he would want to talk to a piece of dough. The girl explained that he could, for example, say what flavor he wanted and think about the enjoyment of the one who would eat it. The protagonist was sure that the dough would provide answers, and with those feelings, he could cook it. The king, in his head, visualized him giving the dough an interrogation. Berkey didn't burn that dough on purpose then. He noticed that if he corrects himself, Andy is happy, it was because of his actions that this happened to the lizard. The king was very sorry, so he wanted to help Salamander eat the flowers. The dish was ready, and Salamander was called over to try it. Taking a bite into the lizard, flames swam up again, the beauty of which was admired by the protagonist. The king said that the lizard wanted to help Andy with the creation of that device. In fact, the salamander had been watching Andy the whole time. The girl was very grateful to be offered help. The king watched from the sidelines, all stained with dough. He hoped he was able to help at least a little. Berkey realized that when he saw the girl so happy, these sauces took on great significance. About the appliance, he said it might make sense to make this dish bigger to cover the entire surface. The main character was riding Manticore. She said that the king marveled at the dish. The girl understood that Berkey had his reasons since he wished such a thing, but the problem was if there was enough soy in the city. When Manticore and the protagonist arrived at the township, they realized it was completely empty. Everything around it was scattered, doors all open. The girl realized that if she returned with nothing, the king would be very upset. The protagonist decided to go somewhere else. The feudal lord was riding in the carriage and reasoned that, finally, it was time for the first delivery. He spent all the money on this case, but soon he will be able to get a decent sum and will be able to buy an even better carriage. Then they would have more customers and expand their borders. The feudal lord was dreaming of riches, and his thoughts were interrupted by his assistant saying that there was something he should look at. A wagon wheel was stuck in the mud, and the men were pushing it, but it wouldn't move. The feudal thought that the main rule was trust. He didn't know if they would make it in time. Besides, he didn't feel comfortable that the monster and the witch would suddenly reappear. Feudal knew that they were not far from that very place and told the men to move faster, because they needed to get out of here as soon as possible. He was afraid that they would meet the witch again like they did then. The feudal lord decided he could do it all by himself and started pushing the wagon, but he couldn't move it. He turned his head and saw that the man was not helping him, but was looking somewhere else. In the distance, Manticore was running with Andy in the sunlight. The protagonist recognized the mister from that town as being there. The feudal lord was already mentally saying goodbye to life, to his wife and son. He was apologizing for failing to be a good husband and father. His business. His business could close without even delivering a single grain of soybeans. The feudal lord didn't know what to do if he died at the hands of the witch. Not even his body would be left. Andy called out to Mr. He remembered his grandmother's story that once, long ago, a witch had shown up in town and would run away if people threw soybeans at her as hard as they could. The feudal lord decided that was what he would do now. The main character realized it was amazing to meet that Mr. again. She thought he was kind, so he would help find the nearest village. The image doesn't always match the reality, unfortunately. The feudal lord, filling his pockets with soy, he was sure that like last time it wouldn't be like last time, and he would be able to deal with the evil witch. Andy came down to the ground and greeted Mr. The man started throwing soy into the main character. The girl caught it with the hem of her dress and was glad that the man was so generous in sharing soy. It was a gift. Andy told the feudal lord that he helped her a lot last time, and now he helped her again, and she didn't even know how to thank him. The man thought it was a witch's trick. The girl said that she was very worried about him when he passed out. The feudal man fantasized that the witch was testing his health, and it was very bad because she was using him as an experiment. The man screamed that he had health problems, that he had a fungal disease on his feet, so bad that he suffered from itching and it spread everywhere, and now he was under a lot of stress. The feudal man went on to say that the stench made it impossible for him to sleep properly. It was difficult for him to breathe and even painful to swallow. And every week he suffered from constipation and diarrhea, running to the toilet at night and during the day. The men he was traveling with were horrified at what they heard, and the protagonist took a few steps back as well. The feudal lord decided he should just run. The protagonist thought about how difficult this must be for him, and despite all the difficulties, he helped her. The girl didn't even know what to say to him. She saw that there was a problem with the carriage wheel that was stuck in the mud. The protagonist was shocked by the kindness of this man and asked Manticore to help these people. He deftly lifted the carriage with his paw and tossed it up, and the people scattered. The protagonist returned to the Dragon King's palace and was washing the soybean. It was a little clay, but in excellent condition. Burkus remembered the girl saying she was coming to get the soybeans, but realized something had happened. He watched her with the help of the bee. The girl looked tired, and Burkus couldn't blame her. Once she came, she continued working without a single rest. The Dragon King didn't understand where she was getting all this energy from. The protagonist couldn't wash her clothes, but realized she had no other. The king appeared behind her. He said he didn't even know what was making her go forward, but she was pushing herself to exhaustion again and asked if the girl knew how he was looking after her afterward. The Dragon King picked up the girl who was almost falling asleep and told her to get enough rest. He laid Andy on the soft manticore. She was talking in her sleep that all the soy was in clay and it was hard. Through the dream, the protagonist said that if she made a new dish for the king, it would taste even better. The king told Manticore to listen carefully and said that he was the one helping Andy to make Meja delicious. The next day, the protagonist slept well, and all her monster friends gathered around. She told them to let her know if they were uncomfortable and encouraged them to do so. They were going to cook a new dish. 1,000 years ago, when Armor had been endowed with a living soul by the previous Dragon King, told him to try to keep this place safe. After all, it was his duty. That's how it had lived for a long time, as the mightiest Armor for its past master. Andy wasn't sure if she could ask for a favor. Armor was willing to serve Andy. The gargoyle poured soy into him. He did a few somersaults and thus cleared the soy inside his armor. Now it was Manticore's turn to help. Andy scattered the soy onto the canvas, and Deho, with a press of his paw, was able to pulverize everything. Cooking this dish was really a real team effort. The protagonist thanked everyone for their help and said that all that was left was to wait and everything would be ready. Before waking up, the Dragon King heard the wonderful smell of soy pies. He had colorful dreams where he was diving, riding a unicorn, and suddenly woke up to a pungent smell. Burkus got up and didn't realize what smelled so bad. He assumed it could be a high-ranking demon or even a demon lord. The king was angry that someone was able to disturb his sleep and promised to erase him from this world. The king saw something made of soybeans cooking on a rock and giving off that very odor. Andy told him that it was enough to make soy patties, and mold had spread on them well because salamander had heated them well. The girl said a couple more days, and they could start making the sauce by next month. The Dragon King was upset that he wouldn't get to eat the soy patties and went to his couch to sleep.